Among the calamities that have plagued Bucharest over the course of time, the most victims have been caused by famine and disease. Famine has sometimes been caused by very hot and dry weather, a complete lack of rain, which scorched and destroyed not only the crops, but also the grass that is essential for the animals' food. At other times, famine was caused by endless wars that ravaged the land and depleted its food reserves. None of the diseases have devastated people like the plague, and often famine and plague occurred simultaneously, making the devastation even more horrific. At other times, misfortunes followed one another. First, the wars with the Turks, Tatars, or Germans, then the terrible famine, and finally the plague, from which people fled in terror, abandoning their possessions just to save their lives. The plague ripped the lives of people without mercy. Documentary evidence of it dates back thousands of years. Ancient historical sources mention it among the Egyptians, Jews, and other ancient peoples. Of all the plagues recorded in history, the deadliest and most horrifying to humanity was the Black Death or the Black Plague in the 14th century, which raged from 1346 to 1352. It originated in the depths of China, spread to Mesopotamia, the shores of the Caspian Sea and the Sea of Azov, then to the Volga region and Kaffa, from where it reached Constantinople and contaminated the entire East, the north of Africa, and all of Europe. It is estimated that a quarter of the probable population of Europe at that time, which was 24 million people, perished in this epidemic, and the probable number of victims was even higher in Asia. As for the Romanian lands, the plague is only known from the 15th century. This does not mean that it did not ravage the lands before. It is mentioned in Moldova in 1443, in both principalities in 1476, in 1480, while in 1495 it wreaked havoc in Transylvania and Wallachia. From the 16th century, unfortunately, it begins to be well known in all countries, and in the next century, when news of the plague was heard, the urban population fled in terror to the mountains, more frightened than by the invasion of the Tatars or the Turks. In 1660, the Turks and Tatars plundered Moldavia and Wallachia, taking with them over 50,000 inhabitants from Wallachia. Famine and plague completed the desperate picture of the country. The chronicler Muste, in relation to a rebellion which occurred in 1660, says that during that time there was a great famine in Wallachia. In 1676, a terrible plague raged in Bucharest. Gheorghe Ducavoda, frightened by the devastation caused by the deaths, resorted to the last means of defense. He fled from Bucharest and settled in Cocorești, on the estate of the commissioner Vlad Cocorescu. The provincial governors he had left in Bucharest also fled in terror. Bucharest remains completely deserted until the spring of 1677, when the plague ceases. The frequent epidemics of the plague, which terrified the ruling authorities, along with a very high number of unburied dead left in the deserted houses and streets, led to the creation of a well-paid group of people, undertakers, tasked with collecting the bodies and burying them, cleaning the city, and erasing the traces of the plague. The undertakers were recruited from former plague victims who had escaped death and were said to no longer be affected by the disease. The assault of the Turks on the Habsburg Empire, culminating in the siege of Vienna in 1683, led to the invasion of the Romanian lands by the Turks, Tatars, and Poles, causing a terrible famine. In Iași, the chronicler Nicolae Costin recounts that a gypsy deceived a poor girl and lured her into an empty cellar where she was offed and mutilated. He also tells that many people died of hunger, and because the bodies were lying on the streets, wolves began to eat those dead bodies because it was impossible to bury all the corpses. At the beginning of Constantin Brâncoveanu's reign in 1689, a terrible plague raged in Bucharest, which subsided but returned again in 1693. When the plague appeared in Bucharest, the destitute population, who had no means to flee like the ruling family and the nobles, abandoned their homes and scattered in the fields, forests, and towards the mountains. The terror of death was so great that people's minds could no longer judge and find the best defense. The news of the plague spread fear like a raging fire, causing people to flee just as they would in the face of a devastating fire. The nobles, who had no one to protect their belongings in their homes, piled their valuable possessions into chests and boxes and entrusted them to priests to guard them in the churches. However, the plague followed them, and many of those who fled never returned. Brâncoveanu usually sought refuge in Cotroceni or Plătărești, and after he built the palace at Mogoșoaia, he would go there to be protected and closer to the seat of his rule. Only in 1706-1707, when the plague proved more devastating than ever, Brâncoveanu retreated with his family to the former princely palace in Târgoviște. In 1718, the plague broke out again in Bucharest. There had been a major war between the Turks and the Austrians, and Turkish troops had caused a rebellion in the country, leading to famine. In Bucharest, every day there were people found dead from hunger. But alongside famine, the plague also emerged to complete the miserable picture of the city and the entire country. There aren't many details about the devastation, but it reminds us of it the poetic inscription on the stone cross raised by Serdar Matei Mogoș, which is preserved to this day inside the old Oboru church. At the end of the 18th century, it was believed that plague epidemics had certain cycles and recurred about once every 10 years. However, this fact had not been confirmed because from the 18th century onwards, these epidemics began to occur at shorter intervals and continued for years on end. The plague of 1730, although not very violent, engulfed Nicolae Mavrocordat and his brother Ion, both former rulers, in its whirlwind. In 1735, Grigore Ghica took measures to combat the plague and protect the population of Bucharest from the fury of the disease, including the establishment of a hospital in Pantelimon with a special section for plague victims. The decree issued on October 12, 1735, which decided the construction of this hospital, states, "We have deemed it necessary to build from the foundation a holy and divine house, in which a hospital for poor and sick people shall be established, not only for those suffering from various bodily ailments, but also for those who, having distanced themselves from God, would suffer from the plague, for in this country and in the city of the princely seat of Bucharest, such a terrible and devastating disease often brings suffering among the people, sometimes even during winter, when the poor who, lacking shelter, and should not be among the healthy or outside, suffer greatly in the bitter cold and unbearable storms and lose their lives." Furthermore, the decree specifies about the section for plague victims. "I have decided that separate houses shall be built for them near the enclosure of the hospital, in a place outside, so that the sick, those afflicted with the plague, shall be kept apart, like in a lazaretto, so as not to mix with the other sick who suffer from different diseases." However, the hospital was not completed by its founder, as Grigore Ghica, during that year, was transferred to Iași. Nevertheless, he entrusted Metropolitan Stefan with the completion of the work. The new ruler of Moldavia organized the Guild of the Undertakers in Iași, which had existed for a long time, but needed a new establishment. Despite all efforts to contain and prevent the plague from claiming so many victims, the disease continued its whirlwind of death and sorrow. In 1737-1738, during Constantin Mavrocordat's third reign as a ruler of the country, the plague claimed numerous victims. In Bucharest alone, 33,000 people, 233 priests and 3 bishops had died. News of the plague in the Romanian lands had spread as far as Leipzig, where many Romanian merchants went in search of goods. Consequently, the Great Autumn Fair of 1737 couldn't be held due to the fear of danger. In the last year of his second reign, in 1752, Grigore Ghica organized the Guild of Undertakers in Bucharest in a different manner than he had done in Moldova. He set the number of undertakers at 20, placed under the leadership of a captain later known as the head of the undertakers. He also determined their responsibilities, taking care of the plague-stricken, removing and transporting them to the hospital, isolating them, disinfecting houses, inspecting neighborhoods to identify hidden patients, and burying the deceased. Among the undertakers, there were also women responsible for attending to the needs of females, children, and girls. As seen in the princely decree, the undertakers were exempt from taxes. They were to be free and at peace from all financial burdens and obligations, both in the countryside and in the city of Bucharest, without any interference or disturbance whatsoever. The undertakers had at their disposal a carriage with 2 horses covered with a canopy in which they transported the sick to the hospital. The Undertakers Guild was under the authority of the Aga and directly commanded by the Chief Aga of Bucharest. In 1786 they were paid $3 per month. However, the plague continued to wreak havoc. In 1756, a new epidemic frightened the people of Bucharest. It passed quickly but reappeared in 1759. Then there were about 20 years of calm when the people of Bucharest seemed to have forgotten about the plague and its terrifying scythe. In December 1783, a few cases emerged in Bucharest, but the outbreak was contained only to resurface the following autumn when a gypsy suspected of having the plague died. The news terrified everyone and orders were issued to try and contain the disease. For an entire year, orders crossed paths and measures clashed. On November 20th, 1784, it was decided that fairs would either be moved to the fields or closed. The scourge was halted, but in January 1785, a few cases were once again discovered in the country and around Bucharest. In 1786, a decree was issued that established measures to combat the plague. Interestingly, even in this decree, the class distinction between the nobility and the poor was maintained. If anyone of noble lineage or noble status was affected by this disease, they were to be removed from their homes only by the command of the country's ruler. Even in the face of death, the nobility did not give up their status. The undertakers, chosen among the most despicable individuals in Bucharest, had started to commit atrocities against the plague-stricken. To avoid the effort of transporting them to the hospital, they would offer them on the way or bury them alive. In the decree of the plague quarantine from 1786, it was decided, due to the numerous cruel and indecent acts committed by the undertakers towards the sick in order to steal from them, and because they endanger many of the patients on the way to the hospital, it shall always be ordered that a guard be assigned to accompany the sick person from afar, so that the undertaker does not have time to commit such actions and cruelty. If any undertaker is proven to dare to carry out such acts, they shall be punished with the ultimate punishment, death as a murderer. However, the plague continued its deadly game. On December 20th, 1787, news spread that an outbreak had occurred in Buzău, but it was quickly extinguished. In the early spring of 1792, it erupted with fury in Bucharest, with 2 neighborhoods being contaminated by July. Within a few days, the disease spread and only a neighborhood remained unaffected. The lack of a specialized doctor was noted. In August, the number of undertakers rose to 60. On September 16, 1792, a statistical report was compiled regarding the progress of the disease in Bucharest. 74 deaths from June 18th to July 31st. 248 patients cured, 204 deaths in the month of August, 116 patients cured in that month, and 334 patients in the hospital by August 31st. In November, the disease notably weakened and eventually subsided. However, it reappeared in 1793 in the countryside and then in Bucharest. The autumn of 1794 was particularly difficult because of a lack of food. The population of the country and Bucharest suffered from famine. Alexandru Moruții, the ruler at that time, intervened with Mercelius, the Austrian agent in Bucharest, to secure the import of grain from Transylvania. In the spring of 1795, as famine and the plague continued their macabre dance, a new calamity struck: locusts. Various measures are taken to contain the plague. An overseer of the plague is appointed for each neighborhood, responsible for reporting each individual case. Those who fail in their duty are punished with 200 lashes on the soles of their feet and banishment to Snagov. Priests are obliged to go from house to house and report the sick. Houses, individuals, and streets are to be disinfected. The wives of the undertakers are to be sent away from Bucharest. Priests and senior priests who conceal the disease are to be shaved, stripped of their priesthood, and brought to trial by the Department of Prisons. A local fair is closed for a period of 30 days. Funerary meals and memorial services for the dead are prohibited. The poor and beggars who are unfit for work are to be rounded up and confined in monasteries, with the treasury providing them with 1.5 thalers per month per family for their sustenance. The undertakers of the plague hospital are to be shot if they leave the hospital and come to Bucharest, or if they fail to fulfill their duties as stated in the decree of 1786. The head of the undertakers, who had shown no competence in this matter, was fined 100 thalers and sent to exile in Snagov. The guards who do not obey the commands of the high-ranking officials are sent to labor camps, and so on. But the disease continues its course and is not hindered by these measures. Alexandru Moruții decides to establish a hospital in Lazareto for the plague-stricken in Dudești. A year later, when the balance is made, the number of deaths approaches 10,000. The lack of a specialized doctor in the plague became the greatest concern of the rulers. Eventually, Ștefan Hiotu was found, who was appointed as the overseer of the hospital in Lazareto in Dudești, with a salary of 50 thalers per month. He was not a doctor, but simply knowledgeable about the plague, as he had previously served as the head of the undertakers, but he was quickly replaced by a real doctor. With the entrance of Ion Karaja as the ruler of the country in 1812, the plague broke out again in Bucharest. The arrival of this ruler in Bucharest marked the beginning of great calamities in the country. On the very night of his inauguration, the princely palace burned to the ground. The next day, on December 13th, the plague broke out among the people who had come with the ruler from Constantinople. While there had been several outbreaks of plague in the country, the records of Romania do not mention a more dreadful disease than Karaja's plague. This scourge had never claimed so many lives. Up to 300 people would die each day, and it is believed that the total number of deaths in the entire country exceeded 90,000. The contagion was so dangerous that even the slightest contact with an infected house would bring death upon an entire family, and the violence of the disease was such that a person struck by the plague was a dead person. Karaja's plague is frequently reflected in the documents of that time. For example, in an affidavit from the great town chief and the head of the merchants regarding the auction sale of some houses belonging to Saftagulogloaia, it is mentioned that the auction did not take place due to the disease of the plague, and approval for a new auction is requested. In another petition to the ruler Ion Karaja from 1816, Ancuța, the wife of a late public servant, in a case regarding a house built on the site of a former monastery, states that the grieving woman's husband and 2 young unmarried sons died from the plague during the outbreak of 1813. The same plague is mentioned in the affidavit from 1819 in a lawsuit arising from a business partnership between Hagi Stama and the inheritors of Hagi Ivan. Then, in the year 1813, during the plague, when Hagi Enache also died from the plague, the shops with all the merchandise remained in Stama's possession and management. After the terrifying plague of 1812, a few years of relative calm followed, although it had not completely disappeared. Slow and less violent outbreaks occurred from time to time. For instance, in 1826, the plague is mentioned in the documents of that time. A seneschal named Radu asks the ruler to delay payment of a debt to ruler's chief of guards Ivancea, as he cannot pay at this particular time of the plague. It seems that the reason was not considered valid, as the ruler sent the petitioner to be tried by the Department of State. Another plague, less devastating than the one in 1812, but still horrifying, occurred in 1828. All attempts to eradicate the disease proved futile, but they managed to mitigate its severity. In the autumn, famine added to the plague, spreading fear among the population. Boyars and foreigners fled from Bucharest, seeking refuge in distant villages. The winter was difficult, and in the spring, the plague wreaked havoc in Bucharest, claiming the lives of many. In May 1829, a commission composed of 16 members was appointed to investigate the sick. Their mission was to identify plague-infected persons and implement isolation and disinfection measures. The disease continued to spread rapidly, and the number of victims increased alarmingly. From May 28th to June 4th, 92 people had fallen victim to the disease, and 5 members of the commission had died of the plague. However, the fury of the disease did not last long, as the number of infected persons decreased each day. The contribution of the Russian military doctors from the occupying army in Bucharest, as well as Dr. Constantin Estiotu, who contracted the plague but survived, played a significant role in eliminating the disease. In September, monetary gratuities were awarded to the doctors and healthcare staff who had fought against the plague. General Yeltuhin, the commander of the Russian troops in the Principalities, died from the plague. His replacement, General Kiselev, upon his arrival in the Principalities, took urgent measures to eradicate the plague. He reorganized the lazarettos, increased the number of doctors, allocated significant sums for the necessary expenses of combating the disease, and succeeded in extinguishing it. The toll of this plague, which began in 1829 and lasted until mid-1830, was 26,302 civilian deaths and 9,557 military deaths, with expenses amounting to 1,602,659 lei. After 1830, the plague began to occur less frequently in Bucharest, and its appearances became sporadic and less violent. After 1850, there are only isolated mentions of the plague in the cities along the Danube.